Okay, this is a fascinating paper, theoretical in some sense, but it's trying to find unifying spatial scaling laws for biodiversity and ecosystem stability. You have some sense of what biodiversity is. Of course, you know what is ecosystem. And you probably know by now I'm not really an expert in this, even though I've had lots of experience in working on NPZD class of models, nutrients, phytoplankton, zooplankton, detritus, which takes several forms. And I've worked with people on tuna modeling as well, upper level. So I learned a little bit about various scaling laws like the allometric scaling, which I've discussed elsewhere in a podcast, and so on. So it's easier to deal with here because there is a nice research article summary which gives the main ideas of the paper, and this appeared in Science just a couple of weeks ago, and we'll read the main paper just very briefly and look at the implications as reported by the authors themselves. Okay, so with all that, what is the introduction? Positive relationship between biodiversity measured as species richness and the temporal stability of ecosystems is well established in theory and empirical work at small spatial scales. So species richness, how do you measure it? That's always a question, right? Stability is okay. If you perturb it, will it return to functional form or will it just collapse? So resilience and stability, they are not always exactly the same, but still. Resilience is the ability to recover from perturbations, and stability is the ability to withstand perturbations and not collapse. They are closely related. However, whether I didn't do a good job there. However, whether and how these insights can be generalized to broader spatial scales in which ecosystem management is typically applied remains elusive. Both species richness and ecosystem stability increase with area, described by species area relationship SAR, and ecosystem stability area relationship, so E star, respectively. Ecosystem stability and area relationship and species area relationship. Integrating these spatial scaling patterns allows us to scale biodiversity stability relationships from small to large areas and to predict how biodiversity and ecosystem stability respond to habitat loss and anthropogenic environmental changes. So we are basically interested in this topic because there is a lot of habitat loss going on, deforestation, urbanization, desertification, and so direct impacts and indirect impacts through increased greenhouse gases. So anthropogenic environmental changes are essentially in every form. And ecosystems are also hit in every level, so temperature change, humidity change, then let's say predator-prey relationship change, and top predator is affected directly by larger modes of variability like El Nino because of the impacts on food on the food chain and so on and so forth. The rationale of the study: to understand the link between SAR and E stars, species area and ecosystem stability in area, specifically their log-log slopes, that is Z star and S star, Z star and the Z star. We develop a new theoretical framework that petitions the spatial scalings of ecosystem stability into two components: the spatial scaling of average species stability and that of species asynchrony. Using this framework, we employ spatial ecological models to illustrate how ecosystem stability and its two components scale with area and respond to habitat loss, as well as how these scaling patterns are mediated by changes in species richness. So the biodiversity or species richness itself brings a certain interdependence and stability to the whole ecosystem, but within the ecosystem you have the spatial scaling of average species stability and that of species asynchrony, right? We further investigate the scaling patterns of species richness and ecosystem stability using two extensive data sets: plant communities from the National Ecological Observatory Network NEON in the US and fish communities from the global data set Reef Fish Time. So those are data sets you can follow up with. Here is kind of a nice summary plot. Analyses reveal unified spatial scaling patterns of biodiversity and ecosystem stability. Ecosystem stability area relationship S star can be partitioned into average species stability area, so SS star, and species asynchrony versus area A star relationships. So there is a species stability area as a star relationship and a species asynchrony area relationship. Theoretically, species area relationships influence E star, S star, whatever, through SS star and A star. Empirical data demonstrate positive correlations between the slopes Z star and Z S star, primarily driven by Z A star, which is the asynchrony area relationship. Habitat loss may gradually reduce ecosystem stability over time, resulting in a stability debt. So the ecosystem has a certain intrinsic stability in natural variability climate system evolved over time, and obviously they have evolved to respond to things like El Nino or lower frequency changes coming at decadal time scales and so on. But when the changes are accelerated by human activities like anthropogenic change and habitat loss, then they have a so-called stability debt, which means they are below their optimal stability that is there in the natural climate. Okay, natural climate also varies on certain time scale, right? You have glacial, deglacial time scales over which ecosystems have evolved, or even have tectonic time scales, millennial time scales, and interannual time scales. Depends on the size of the species, the environmental niches they have selected, and so on and so forth. So species that lives in eastern Pacific, anchovies, sardines, have a different strategy than the species living in warmer waters like, let's say, tuna, and even tuna have tropical species and cold water species and so on. So there are many details, but we are looking for species area relationship and species ecosystem stability and area relationship. I have some call. Sorry, I had to take that call. Somebody arriving soon, so I have to let's keep moving. So I hope intuitively you know what is species asynchrony. Basically, I didn't define it, but actually I realized maybe you don't know what it is. It's basically all species don't respond the same way to the same perturbation. Let's say there is a temperature perturbation of a certain scale, or precipitation, humidity, and other things, habitat loss, and not each species responds similarly, and that itself can be part of the stability on how the ecosystem has evolved to remain stable. So different responses of the species is part of the stability. That's species asynchrony. Okay, so here we are, ecosystem stability. It's a log scale of EST, and there is of course log A, area itself. So you have Z star is defined as SSTAR plus A star, so stability and area. So just try to remember in that way. So average species stability is shown here, and species asynchrony brings the ecosystem stability down, but there is an upscaling as area increases, stability also increases. Okay, there is a relation between the area of the ecosystem itself. We haven't defined rigorously what it is, but there are many ways to think about it. the biodiversity and ecosystem are related in a way of, let's say, ecosystem health. Some people think of ecosystem health, which is a combination of complexity or biodiversity and total productivity and resilience, or how quickly they can recover from perturbation. So stability and resilience again are similar. Okay, ecosystem stability and log, so again log scale here and log area again. So obviously as habitat loss happens, the area decreases, and then you have ecosystem stability area relation, which if things happen slowly enough can attain equilibrium. So there is a time scale involved of the changes that determines in what form the ecosystem survives after the change. So there is a stability debt. That means this is the natural stability under natural climate variability, let's say, and this is where you end up in a new equilibrium. They call it a debt. Okay, makes sense, right? So here are how the feedbacks work, but let's see this. So there is a Z S star, so ecosystem stability area relationship log scale, and again you are looking at species area relationship, and there is a negative scale correlate. Well, if area slope of the species area relationship increases, then the stability slope also increases, and this seems to work both for the plants and fishes. I'm being very brief, but please read the paper if you're an expert or you want to learn more. So what are the kind of feedbacks then? You have species area relationship, species ecosystem stability area relationship as log slopes. So the average species stability area feeds into ecosystem stability area, which itself is related to species area slope. So basically the slope means how quickly stability changes, right? As if you change the area due to habitat loss, let's say, then ecosystem stability is varying on a logarithmic scale. So perturbations can get amplified very quickly through the ecosystem functioning. And on this side, you are going from species area relationship to species asynchrony area relationship, because not all species respond similarly, as we said, and that is going to affect your ecosystem stability area relationship as well. Okay, so there's some kind of a uniform Bisserian principle saying area can change, ecosystem itself, composition and complexity, biodiversity will change, but there are scaling laws that relate the ecosystem species level to ecosystem level, and also stability. Okay, so that's the main idea. So I'm just trying to explain it without getting too technical. Theoretical models predict that as sample area increases, both ecosystem stability and average species stability generally increase, whereas species asynchrony may either increase or decrease. So the responsibility of the species themselves may change as the ecosystem stability doesn't necessarily mean all species stay together. It's just that as a functional unit, the ecosystem. So for example, when warming happens and let's say tropical latitudes expand, entire ecosystems don't move, but species move. So the ecosystem composition changes as well, but it can still remain stable as an ecosystem. Ecosystems with a steeper accumulation of species richness with area, such as high ZSR log slope, demonstrate a faster increase in stability with area, so they have higher ZS star. The positive correlation between ZSR and ZS star emerges because higher species richness generates more asynchronous dynamics and thus stronger stabilizing effects at larger scales. Okay, so species or ecosystems may have evolved in a way that their asynchronous response to perturbations actually is part of the stability, and that has a relation with how they scale with area. Following habitat loss, species richness gradually declines over time, exhibiting an extinction debt. Okay, again the concept of how stable you are and how resistant you are to extinction, and as habitat loss happens, you come down on that stability, leading to extinction, and then you end up with a stability debt. Extinction debt. This extinction debt of species in turn leads to a delayed decrease in ecosystem stability, which we term stability debt. A larger debt in ecosystem stability occurs when there is a larger extinction debt. All these are critical because how to monitor ecosystems? You can't keep on tracking species. You want to be able to track forest levels, for example, or even larger, especially when you have cross-boundary ecosystems. Many countries share coastlines, they share forests, and so on, right? Empirical analysis reveal patterns consistent with theoretical predictions for both plants and fishes. Ecosystem stability and average species stability increase with area, whereas species asynchrony either increases or decreases with area across neon sites and river basins. So rivers are also shared by countries, so tracking ecosystems becomes very critical when you have such shared, when the ecosystem is split between artificial boundaries made by humans. The scaling exponents of biodiversity and ecosystem stability, Z star and ZS star, are positively correlated primarily due to a greater species asynchrony as species richness increases with increasing scales. In plant communities, the scaling exponents of both diversity and ecosystem stability increase with precipitation. In plant communities, the scaling exponents of both biodiversity and ecosystem stability increase with precipitation, whereas those of fish communities are unaffected by climatic factors. Think about that. Fish live in water which is high heat content and varies much more slowly. Plants live on land, air temperatures and soil qualities or carbon content, etc., can change rapidly. So obviously you expect plants and fish to develop differently, and dependence on climatic factors to be very different. So the asynchrony within the ecosystem is one thing, but different species, different ecosystems like plants and fish also will be very different in their response to climate. So concluding, by integrating two foundational scaling laws in ecology, SAR and S star, so species area relationship and ecosystem stability and area relationship, our study underscores the broad applicability of biodiversity stability relationships across spatial scales. It predicts that ongoing biodiversity loss could lead to ecosystem destabilization at large scales, which is critical. So you may be monitoring only a small part of the ecosystem, let's say because it's divided by boundaries, but you have to understand how the ecosystems are connected and how the entire thing is operating under perturbations from humans. It predicts, the scaling laws predict that ongoing the biodiversity loss could lead to ecosystem destabilization at large scales. So in fisheries you have the concept of fishing down the food web, so you are catching, let's say, top predators like tuna by a lot, you are perturbing the entire ecosystem. On land you are logging selectively, or you are doing not just across the board habitat loss, but also species specific removals, which can be habitat loss of different kinds, area loss or species loss. So that is also possible. So biodiversity loss happens that way. Habitat loss and landscape homogenization are also anticipated to destabilize ecosystem. So let's say you are doing plantation and replacing species on the Western Ghats with rubber plants, then you're also creating such destabilization potential. The destabilization following habitat loss may unfold gradually over time, resulting in a stability debt. So weakened stability analogous to the extinction debt of species, so the potential to just collapse. Understanding how anthropogenic activities influence the scaling properties of biodiversity and ecosystem stability is crucial for sustainable ecosystem management in the area of rapid environmental change. So that message is clear. So just to keep in mind that we are talking about species area relationship and ecosystem stability and area relationship, and asynchrony is part of it. So let's read the abstract of the main paper, which says unifying spatial scaling laws of biodiversity and ecosystem stability. While both species richness and ecosystem stability increase with area, how the scaling patterns are linked remains unclear. So evolution has happened, and we are used to looking at it as stability and biodiversity, so species richness and ecosystem stability. But nature has worked, life has worked together to find loopholes in nature's laws so that it can survive perturbations. But now we are a perturbation, but also a very rapid perturbation, which is testing the evolutionary ability of the species. Our theoretical and empirical analysis of plants and fish communities show that the spatial scaling of ecosystem stability is determined primarily by the scaling of species asynchrony, how they respond to perturbations, at what rate, and so on, which is in turn driven by the scaling species of richness. Okay, so biodiversity and asynchrony. So asynchrony can also be species that move. So you have sedentary specialists and mobile generalists. Some species can adapt and move, geographically when temperatures and precipitation or humidity change, whereas some species cannot move and they will just become less stable and may even go extinct and so on. Okay. So asynchrony, which is in turn driven by scaling of species richness, they are all related. In wetter regions, plant species richness and ecosystem stability both exhibit faster accumulation with area, implying potentially greater declines in biodiversity and stability following habitat loss. So that's a key insight as well, where things will be more vulnerable, let's say. The decline in ecosystem stability after habitat loss can be delayed, creating a stability debt mirroring the extinction of debt of species. By unifying two foundational scaling laws in ecology, our work underscores that ongoing biodiversity loss may destabilize ecosystems across spatial scales. Okay, so this is just the illustration of species area stability, area relationships. We already kind of understood it. So here is abundance, here is time. So you have ecosystem stability, perturbations like natural climate variability may come along, but basically the ecosystem in terms of abundance remains at some steady level. And then you have species area relationship and ecosystem stability and area relationship, which also are sometimes in phase, sometimes out of phase, but basically asynchrony, stability and species richness are all related in nature. So the idea is to find scaling laws. So here is species diversity versus area. As area increases, species diversity increases, and so does stability. Okay, and here is ecosystem stability area. This is species level, and this is ecosystem level. Okay, and there is species asynchrony, which acts on top, so that you can decrease or increase stability as you do a lot of perturbations. So you can see here sometimes the abundance is going down, sometimes it's going up. In each of these deviations, asynchrony is working as well, but they are all together in the entire ecosystem functioning. Whether the richness is selected for optimizing the ecosystem health in terms of productivity, biodiversity, and resilience, that's a separate issue. Okay, I don't know enough to talk about it. Implications then. Our study provides a theoretical benchmark for understanding the spatial scaling of ecosystem stability and its relationship with the species area relationship. By leveraging data surveyed using standardized protocols across multiple spatial scales and within naturally assembled communities, our empirical analysis revealed consistent spatial scaling patterns of biodiversity and ecosystem stability for plant and fish communities across broad climatic conditions. So you basically show that your results are robust in terms of the scaling by using completely different ecosystems like plants and fish, and all of them or both of them in very different regimes of climate conditions, so that the responses, the perturbations themselves, and everything is to be verified, right? So spatial heterogeneities in climatic conditions are relatively low in the neon data that they used, or the river basins. Thus, spatial turnover of species contributes to the major sources of asynchronous dynamics that enhances ecosystem stability across scales. Basically, that means there is a low let's say a low frequency response as an ecosystem, but within that, species themselves may be turning over, which means one species may disappear during a certain perturbation and another one may take over the niche, and then things change over time. But there is an ecosystem, there is species richness, and then there is species composition. Okay, by unifying spatial scaling patterns of biodiversity, species asynchrony, and ecosystem stability, our results uncover a functional implication of the well-known species-area relationship. Our findings also have implications for ecological conservation and management. Just as habitat loss has a clear negative effect on biodiversity across scales, our results show positive stability-area relationships, which suggest that habitat destruction could also impair species and ecosystem stability. This becomes very critical. Let's say you have a big forest or a nice vegetated area, and a developer will come along and say, I will keep a lot of the vegetation intact and just build within that. Okay, so that means you are basically reducing the effective area of the ecosystem. So what is the impact of that? We already know that fragmented ecosystems affect biodiversity because the connectivity is lost. So some birds, insects, even megafauna don't move. Deer, how they are affected by a highway running through a forest and so on. And you also have other issues I won't go into, but I've discussed elsewhere, that if people are living very close to the woods in some parts of the US, deer are there, they don't have a predator, so their deer ticks and Lyme disease are coming along. People are saying we don't want wooded area near our housing. So this becomes very complicated very quickly. So based on our observed variations in E-star, so ecosystem stability in the area relation, we also expect that destabilizing effects of habitat destruction on plant and fish communities would be more pronounced in more biodiverse sites. For plant communities, habitat loss could have greater destabilizing effects in wetter regions because they have a larger log slope. As a result, the severe habitat loss in the tropical rainforest, for example, may not only have intense influence on biodiversity but also pronounced impacts on ecosystem stability. This could also suggest a possible interaction between climate change and habitat loss in reshaping the biodiversity itself and stability of the plant communities, if the climate dependence of ecosystem stability area relationship is similar across spatial and temporal climatic gradients. Moreover, conditions such as reduced habitat heterogeneity or loss of regionally rare species can lead to biotic homogenization and a reduction in species accumulation with area, potentially decreasing ecosystem stability at large scales. A more complete understanding of how anthropogenic factors alter the scaling properties of biodiversity and ecosystem stability could be particularly relevant to sustainable ecosystem management in the area of biodiversity and environmental changes. Beautiful, right? So obviously I'm not an expert, I don't understand all the subtleties, but nonetheless I hope I have conveyed the main messages. And there are additional things like how pollinators are related to plant species. You're only looking at plant ecosystem. What is the role of pollinators? Because we are also affecting bees and birds and so on. So that also has to be added, but maybe that's part of the ecosystem stability as defined here and species richness. And for fisheries, of course, human activities like fishing are part of the habitat loss, but there is also the top-down fishing pressure, and so this very complicated, but this is addressing some parts of this complicated issue in a very meaningful way. Okay, let's leave it here.